Hi friends, I am Basavaraj Bilgi. Uh, Today we will discuss new criticism, method of literary criticism which happened in 20th century in America and England. What is new criticism? New criticism is also a method of evaluating a literary text like all other schools of criticism. It is also a school of criticism. It is a method of analyzing a text. New criticism precedes formalism. A very next moment after formalism, new criticism happens. Now we will see who are the pioneers of new criticism. The 20th century is synonymously used with the name of T.S. Eliot. He has contributed for all the areas of literature. He wrote poems, he wrote drama, he wrote critical essays, and he also tried in many different areas of literature his hands. That's where T.S. Eliot comes uh, first in the pioneers of new criticism. He defines the meaning of a text of a poem as a poem's existence is somewhere between the writer and the reader. Till now, what we have considered is we read every poem. Before going to read the poem, we studied the historical backgrounds of the writer and the time in which it was written, and his psychological conditions were also taken into consideration when we read the poem. But T.S. Eliot says the poem's existence is somewhere between the writer and the reader. It is not in the writer, it is neither in the writer nor in the reader. It is somewhere between these two people. What we thought? We thought that the writer is the creator and the reader is the consumer. But T.S. Eliot disproves that. That's where we can see the lines of a new criticism taking its shape. The next person is I.A. Richards. He defines a book is a machine to think with, but it need not, therefore, usurp the functions either of the bellows or the locomotive. I. Richards says that a book is like a well gelled machine which works according to the instructions given. Thus, the writer is not a god. Writer is not the creator. He just delivers. He just give instructions to a machine, and the reader gets the functions what he wish. That's what the meaning of the definition is. The next person is John Crow Ransom. He wrote a book called The New Criticism in 1941, and because of this book, the school of some particular people have got the title The New Criticism. John Crow Ransom defines criticism as criticism must become more scientific or precise and systematic. Until now, we were not ready to consider criticism as science. But John Crow Ransom says criticism must be more scientific. We have to do a scientific analysis of a particular text, and it should be precise. We should not write all the background of the writer, and we should not bring about all the psychological aspects, environmental aspects into the poem. When we are analyzing the poem, we should not take into consideration all these things. That's what John Crow Ransom says. Then, who are the important critics of this school? As we know, John Crow Ransom stands first in the ladder. His book, The New Criticism, which was written in 1941, contributes more for the development of this school. He wrote essays called Criticism.inc, The Ontological Critic. Next person is I. Richards, whose books are Practical Criticism, The Meaning of Meaning, and next comes the Nobel laureate. His essay Tradition and Individual Talent and Hamlet and His Problems contribute for the development of new criticism school. The next person is William Empson, whose essay Seven Types of Ambiguity contributes for the development of the school. The next person is Cleanth Brooks. He wrote The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry. Next critics are William Wimsatt and Beardsley. They together wrote an essay called The Intentional Fallacy and the Affective Fallacy, in which they categorize how the intention of the writer is mistaken and what is the affective fallacy, how a particular text affects on the mind of the reader. They discuss these things in those essays, and we will see all these essays in detail in our further lectures. Rene Wellek and Austin Warren. They wrote Pure and Impure Poetry, in which they discuss the qualities of a poem, the qualities of poetry. Now we will see the principles of new criticism. What might be the principles of new criticism? They say a poem is in itself. They believe that a poem or a work of art should be treated as an object in itself, primarily as poetry and not another thing. We should consider poetry as poetry only. We should not consider it as the autobiographical content of the writer. When we are analyzing or evaluating a particular work, we should not refer to the biography of the author or to the social conditions at the time of its production. We should not consider the biography of the author. As well, we should not take into consideration the social conditions at the time of its writing. And the psychological and moral effects on the reader should also be rejected, they say. These critics tend to minimize recourse to the history of literary genres and subject matter. They say that the critic must approach the work with an open mind, and the critic should be ready to read or study the poem as it is in itself. A critic should not search for the meaning of the poem in the biography of the writer, and he should not search for the meaning of the poem in the sociological conditions or psychological conditions of the time of the production of that particular poem. The next principle is explication or close reading. Close reading is the detailed and subtle analysis of the complex interrelations of the words, and these people try to find out the ambiguities of the words which are used in the poem, and they say that the component they try to find the component elements of the work of art. This close reading technique is brought from I.A. Richards' Practical Criticism, which was written in 1929, and William Empson's 7 Types of Ambiguity. These people, the new critics, are concerned with the study of words and the structure of poetry. They do not bother about other things than the words which are there in the poem. For example, we will take the poem written by William Wordsworth, Daffodils. We know that the person or the speaker of the poem is walking somewhere, is walking in the countryside, and when he looks at the daffodils, he comes off with an exaggeration. He says, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats high over the vales and hills. If the speaker uses I walked all alone, the poem will be less dramatic. The poet uses I wandered. The word wander is very much important in the poem. And he also says, as a cloud, he himself compares himself to a cloud. That's where we will get different meaning. The cloud symbolizes darkness or loneliness. This is how the new critics believe poems should be written. The next principle is new critics give importance to language or the words. They say that poetry is nothing but communication, and language is the means of communication. Thus, new critics try to understand the full meaning of a poem through the study of poetic language. They read the language, they read the words which are written in the poem, then they try to understand the poem. For new critics, words are very important, and the study of the words is the only key to the poetic meaning of the poem. They believe that literature is to be of a special kind of language which is defined by systematic opposition to the language of science and of logical discourse. And The key concepts of this criticism deal with the meanings and interactions of words, figures of speech, and symbols. There is great emphasis on the organic unity of structure and meaning, and warnings against separating the two by what Cleanth Brooks has called the heresy of paraphrase. They give importance to words, figures of speech, and symbols which are used in the poem by the poet. As in Daffodils, the word cloud is a symbol. It is used as a symbolic, and that's where these new critics find the poem to be of high quality. Vulgarization of meaning. These people talk against vulgarization of meaning. They reacted against the vulgarization of meaning by the rhetoric of mass communication. Alan Tate, one of the new critics, in his essay Tension in Poetry, says many poets were promoted to invent private language or very narrow modes of communication. Because of this, that public speech had become heavily tainted with mass feeling. Alan Tate condemns the tendency of vulgarization or privatization of language as a means of communication. For them, poetry is not mere communication of ideas or attitudes. Rather, poetry is a complex patterning of meaning to be read and appreciated by readers. For them, the structure and texture of a poem is very important. They study the writer's craft in connection with the words which are used in his poem. These people, the new critics, investigate the ways in which ideas are expressed, symbols are used, and they find poetic meaning in the words and in their relationship between ideas and the relationship between imagination and craftsmanship. They make a distinction between the language of science and the language of art. They say scientists' language requires a language purged of every trace of paradox. Apparently, the truth which the poet utters can be approached only in terms of paradox. And they believe that a poem should not mean but be. A poem can be only through its meaning. Since its medium is words, thus we should study words. And that is how we get the complete meaning of the poem, they believe, they tell. And they say poetry is a feat of style, and it is a complexity of meanings. And they divide a particular method to bring out the uniqueness of the poem, and they check the vulgarization of language. The next principle of new criticism is affective fallacy and intentional fallacy. Affective fallacy is a confusion between the reader and the writer, they say. And the design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art. They believe that we should not go with intention of the writer. Also, we should not believe in the effect of the poem on the reader. New criticism try to derive the standard of criticism from the psychological effects of the poem, and the two basic assumptions of romantic criticism are pronounced fallacious. They do not agree that the writer writes with an intention and reader reads with an affective fallacy. They believe that both of them are categorically true and cannot be brought together. In our next video, we will discuss the terms which are the important terms which are used by new critics, like the heresy of paraphrase, close reading, ambiguity, intentional fallacy, affective fallacy, and many more words, many more terms. Thank you.